right, I think we can get started now. Thank you all for joining us today for Lunchtime Art Talks, which, as many of you know, is a weekly series led by Hammer curators on works from our collection. This series will focus on artists featured and made in LA, a version. As the galleries are unfortunately closed to the public due to the pandemic, we thought it was important to highlight works by the incredible artists selected for this year's biennial, and we're really hopeful that the museum will open soon, that we can welcome you all back. My name is Connie Butler, Chief Curator at the Hammer, and I will be facilitating this afternoon's talk on Ser Serpas. Joining me today is my colleague, curatorial assistant Nick Barlow, who will be helping me answer all your questions later in the program. A few Zoom notes before we begin. When the presentation starts, please select Speaker View in the top right corner of your screen, and in the top middle of your screen, please click on View Options to ensure side-by-side and Fit to Window are checked. Please note that today's program is being recorded. You have the option to toggle your camera on and off using the camera icon at the bottom left corner, whatever you're most comfortable with. You'll remain on mute until the end of the presentation, at which point Nick will help me unmute those of you who have questions. And during the presentation, if you have any questions for me or Nick, including any technical issues, you can use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to log those in there. So let me pull up my notes here, and Josephine, let's begin with the first slide. Okay. So I'm really happy to be talking about this work, which is not actually a work in Made in LA. So just to introduce the complicated set of questions that I think that this grouping of things raises for us, I just want to first kind of describe what it is that we're looking at, and say that I think that the reason that I wanted to talk about this collection of things that isn't made in LA on behalf of Ser Serpas is because I'm really confounded by it in a way that I find, all of the most interesting artworks should do. There's something deeply resistant in this work that I find fascinating, and as I've understood it more, it's only become more so. But I have to say that my first encounter with it, here as you see in our lobby gallery with the doors closed, was interesting to me from the start. Mostly because I'm really interested in the question of art that occupies what I think of as this very liminal ground, where it barely becomes something, where it barely becomes and holds the status of art itself. And I think that Ser Serpas is very much in this territory with their work. So this collection of objects is in our lobby gallery, where it has been in this configuration since it came to the museum. Ser Serpas has two parts of their practice, which is on the one hand, a practice that's more based in painting, and I'm going to talk less about that, and then a practice that is really solidly working with found objects, and a kind of accumulation sculpture, for lack of a better term. So when the curators approached Sarah about what to do with after the onset of the pandemic, she had left Los Angeles. They had left Los Angeles for Europe out of some fear about the virus and feeling more comfortable in a different location. And so the question became, what in fact could Sarah do to represent their work in Made in LA? What could we have in our galleries that would represent her practice? And the curators, I think, indicated some preference for this more assemblage, accumulation, sculptural side of her practice. And so what was agreed upon is that objects of refuse, objects of trash, would be collected, which is her usual process, would be brought into our galleries and would be laid out in a grid, not by the artist, but by a combination of an assistant working with our crew to lay these works out, lay these things out, so that they would represent, in a way, the potential of becoming something. So what you see here is actually an accumulation of trash gathered from around the Hammer Museum. And if we go to the next slide, we can get a kind of closer view of it. The image is sort of elongated here in a weird way. The gallery isn't quite as big as it looks. But what you see when you look into the lobby gallery is this kind of grid, a very loose grid of materials. Go to the next slide, please. Sorry, go back to the one at the Hammer. So I want to just read for you the text that is on our website that the artist composed, which in fact is the work of art, but is meant to kind of narrate, I think, what you're seeing here and the experience of what you're seeing here. So what we're seeing has been titled Potential Indefinite Performance, This, That, and Now Again. Ser Serpas is from Los Angeles. She was asked to contribute work from the assisted ready-made portion of her practice to Made in LA 2020. Within the assisted ready-made portion of her practice, she tends to source objects from the area immediately surrounding an exhibition site, gather them at the exhibition site, and produce a work or works at the exhibition site or, quote unquote, on site. This portion of her practice is dependent upon her unfettered access to the areas immediately surrounding the exhibition site and the exhibition site itself, in this case, Made in LA, and the Huntington in San Marino, and requires unconditional discretion on her part in the selection of materials as well as the presentation of the work. Due to her residence in Switzerland, the travel restrictions in place at the time of her allotted installation period, and the existing guidelines that she received concerning authorized qualities of materials for exhibition in the institutions, she was not able to contribute work from this portion of her practice to either site of Made in LA 2020. The objects presented here were collected in the areas surrounding this exhibition site and laid out in a grid in September of 2020. Collectively, they are not a work or works. They were not collected or laid out by the artist. They were not collected or laid out on direct instruction from the artist. Because the qualities of the objects were subject to institutional guidelines instead of the artist's discretion, their selection cannot be apportioned to the artist's practice. Rather, these objects constitute the potential for a work or works, a performance set in an indefinite time. These objects will be properly disposed of at the end of Made in LA. Unquote. So that essentially those two paragraphs are how the artist describes the activity and action that went towards accumulating these objects. Let's go to the next image just to show you what happened and what exists at the Huntington now. And at the Huntington, I think the work is even more, there's a little bit of humor, I think, because when you encounter these things outside, they're even more perhaps trash-like than they are, or immediately identifiable as trash than they are at the Hammer, where bringing them inside the galleries automatically accrues another kind of status, I think, to this accumulation of trash. But at the Huntington, they're sort of just to the right of the galleries where you will enter and see the exhibition. And it literally looks like, you know, something left over from a combination of a construction site or a children's playground. And I do think that there's an interesting kind of aspect of play here and humor in the work too, though it's not generally associated with her work so much. But I think there is a kind of lightness to it, which I find very interesting, an extremely light touch, or something that's so withholding in the touch that the artist has exerted onto the materials, that lightness becomes part of the work's ephemerality and part of how I read it in any case. There are a couple of, for me, let's see, there were a couple of things, quotes actually, that I pulled out of reading and listening to some interviews that the artist has done over the last couple of years that I found really interesting, and that for me buttress this idea of refusal that I think is deeply within the work, this refusal of something to become art, to become sculpture, and even refusal on the part of the artist to become an author. She talks about being given trash and refuse by friends over time, that this was the beginning of how the artist started to use trash, friends that she describes as hoarders. And I think there's this interesting tension in the work between almost a minimalist aesthetic and the notion of hoarding. The artist has said, the area and I inhabit has always been apocalypse. And there's something really interesting, I think, about this notion of apocalypse and kind of dispossessed objects that I think is in the meaning of the work. One of the things I read, the artist describes in her personal history that her mother worked for the LAPD, working with dispossessed objects and sorting through them. And I thought that was quite an interesting, at least visual image that must have impacted the artist greatly, this notion of kind of a constant entropic kind of sorting through things, through objects that have accrued history and memory over time. And then this way that she describes objects as symptoms. There certainly is a relationship between these objects and something of the body, I think, or of the bodily. And I like very much the idea of objects as symptoms. And certainly at this moment in our kind of COVID lives, the whole notion of symptoms and living with objects, and that we're now only living with our objects as opposed to sort of living in real life. I thought that notion was very resonant. And then also Ser Serpas has said that narcissism is important to everything, which I'm very curious about that particular quote. I also wanted to just kind of call into the room a couple of historical references that for me are immediately obvious with this work. So maybe go to the next, let's see. No, the next image. So maybe stop here. This is an installation view of previous works or a previous installation by Ser Serpas in 2018. And what's interesting about this is I think that what you can see is here is a case where the artist has been involved, has been physically present, where you can see the objects have been allowed to come together and have been brought together into sculptural form and underscored, I think, by these very large and present kind of pedestals. So in a way, a kind of very formal extreme to the very loose, informal collection of materials that we see in the Hammer and Huntington installations. But as far as the historic references that I just wanted to bring up, for me, go back to, and there are many that one could talk about, which is what's so interesting about this work, I think. Lots of questions that it raises, but for me, it goes back to a moment in the late 1960s when American artists were, I think, again, or similarly at this kind of ground zero of questioning what sculpture could be and what objecthood meant and what the accumulation of materials meant within art practice. And specifically, I'm just thinking of, and I think we can put these references into the chat if it's useful, Robert Morris's work, but there are many installations by Morris that we could call up, but I was thinking of Scatterpiece from 68 and 9, which was a work he did at the Castelli Warehouse, which was an accumulation of 100 pieces of metal and 100 pieces of felt scattered onto the floor. And this is a moment when lots of very young artists like Robert Morris were experimenting with kind of industrial and post-industrial materials and you know, moving them into former warehouse spaces, which were suddenly becoming the future spaces of galleries, for example. This is a moment when gallery architecture is migrating from the domestic to the industrial, and artists start experimenting with random kind of scattering of materials in space. Also, very importantly, Morris's continuous project Altered Daily, which is the kind of performative accumulation of materials that was titled as such, and then also done as or reinterpreted with Yvonne Rainer as an installation, an ongoing installation. And there was a growing kind of skepticism about the division between activities that happened in the studio and activities that ended up in a gallery. Similarly, in Rainer's choreography, activities of the rehearsal versus activities of the final, that constituted the final dance product, if you will. And I think that that slippage between the activities of the studio, the gathering, the accumulation, the putting together of material and objects versus the final kind of finished product of the gallery is certainly a territory that Ser Serpas is very interested in. And I guess I was just going to finish with thinking about Yvonne Rainer, whose great work of kind of non-choreography in Trio A in 1966 came out of a similar kind of thinking about the materials of the rehearsal. And I wanted to just mention her No manifesto from, I lost my date of it, but I think it's 1964 or 66, where she says, no to spectacle, no to virtuosity, no to transformations and magic and make-believe, no to the glamour and transcendency of the star image, no to the heroic, no to the anti-heroic, no to trash imagery, no to involvement of performer or spectator, no to style, no to camp, no to seduction of spectator by the wiles of the performer, no to eccentricity, no to moving or being moved. So with that, I'm gonna just leave you with those thoughts, which are extremely notational, which is, I think, in the spirit of this work. And I guess we can open it up to questions. Nick?
Connie, thank you so much. We'll now begin answering some of your questions. Again, you can ask questions via the Zoom chat feature at the bottom of the screen, or you can select the participants module at the bottom of the screen, and there will be an option to raise your hand, or you can physically raise your hand and we'll come find you. I guess to start it off, Connie, I have two questions. One would be to kind of, or more kind of a thought, which is I'm interested in the artists you mentioned, Robert Morris and Yvonne Rainer, are both these kind of luminary figures, these kind of important figures of a New York East Coast art scene. And Sarah is working in Los Angeles and is from Los Angeles. Is there anything about kind of her practice that speaks towards Los Angeles? Is there anything about kind of collecting trash from a certain place that then, I guess, does the trash become a kind of Los Angeles trash practice and difference from the New York? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of the LA-ness of her work, if you might.
I don't think I would want to say what is the LA-ness of her work. I mean, specifically, I wouldn't want to answer that. I would love to hear her answer. You know, she very much talks about, you know, being raised in Boyle Heights in East Los Angeles. You know, I mentioned the reference to her mother and her mother's work with the LAPD, but for me, just kind of coming to the work cold, I guess, I don't find, I think that it transcends that. And that's one of the things that I think is interesting about it. I mean, yes, there is the specificity of the trash having been gathered around the museum, but that just happens to be because she was invited to be made in LA. I mean, the trash, if we were in Switzerland, would be collected in Switzerland. You know, it's not, To her, that site specificity, I think, is important because of the process of the collecting, which is important, is how I read it, but not so much because it expresses anything in particular about Los Angeles. So that's what I would say to that. I would love to hear how the artist would answer that, though. And maybe I see Lauren here, maybe the Made in LA curators know more about that than I do.
We have a question from Tom here, which is, being from Los Angeles, the artist is aware of what Westwood and San Marino. How much of this is also a discussion, a level of economic privilege?
Sorry, say that again. How much is the?
I guess without kind of speaking for the artist, the question being, how much of the discussion would you say is about economic privilege in her work?
I think it's definitely there in the work, and she has talked about really publicly in interviews and stuff. Actually, her own very specific critique, for example, of art education and the privilege of art education. She studied at Columbia and finished there in 2017, and I think has a very interesting and very ambivalent position about being a woman of color within that program, and feeling instrumentalized in various ways. And how, so I do think there is a critique about class and the circulation of waste and objects in different economies. Yeah, I mean, I think that is in the work very much.
I guess a question from myself, with this a kind of ephemeral practice in which, or a kind of conceptual practice of collecting, as a museum professional, as a curator, what often is collected? Where does the work kind of exist for, say, a piece like Yvonne Rainer's Trio A, or say, Sarah's pieces or practice?
In terms of being collected?
Yes, in terms of a museum collecting something like this.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that the way that she, in some senses, tries to be critical about the market and about the circulation of her own work, by returning the materials back out into the world after she uses them. So as I understand it, and I probably will get some details of this wrong, but as I understand it, in the past, like with that image I showed you from the show in Switzerland, when the articles of trash accumulate into sculptures, they can in fact be sold, and some have been, but then when they're not, they go back, the material goes back out into the world. So, I mean, yes, there is a way that the work can be collected, but there's also a way that she is constantly kind of undercutting that, or trying to be critical of that, in a way that I think is very related to, if we can say broadly speaking, the same kind of institutional critique that, say, a Barry LeVay was involved in with his scattered installations in the late 60s. Again, that this idea that you make something and then it gets destroyed and then you make it again, which is a strategy we're very familiar with now in contemporary art. But at that time, certainly that was an extremely radical idea, that you make one thing and then you make it again, and then it just goes away. So I think that I do think that's, so yes, it's both. It is possible for it to come into the institution and be collected, but it's also, I think, deeply critical of that too at the same time.
Great. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to place the question in the chat or raise your hand physically, or that. We have a question from Charles. Charles, I'm going to unmute you.
Thank you. With respect to the locations at the museum, does she choose where she would like to have her works placed, or does the museum tell her that this is what we would like to have used, and you choose what you put into it? And then after the selections are made, who makes a determination as to where they're placed and how they're placed?
That's a good question, Charles. And in this case, and again, maybe Lauren wants to speak to this, but actually, I'm remembering there was a little bit of a history here of a negotiation, in fact, that the originally, I think there had been a different idea for her placement. The placement in general, and then I'll turn it over to Lauren, is something that usually is determined by the curators, who then, in dialogue with the artists, then determine if a particular placement is the right one, and then, you know, kind of make a selection of the works based on that. Lauren, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'm also remembering what you're remembering, Connie, which is that, I mean, it's a great question, because actually at the Huntington, the site was very much decided by the artist and insisted upon. And there was a little bit of negotiation with the Huntington, because, you know, there's a lot of people involved into these very manicured landscapes of the Huntington. So there were places where it was possible and safe to have the sculptures, but the artist was very involved in deciding sort of where that would be within the options, I think, if I remember correctly. And at the Hammer, unfortunately, she did not pick that gallery at the Hammer. We ultimately offered her this gallery, and we're grateful that she worked with us on it. But she had an original proposal that was that she wanted to put her sculptures throughout the stairs, that they would go up, you know, the lobby stairs when you're in the lobby and you're walking up to the courtyard. She wanted to have them sort of occupy the stairs, and in a way interfere with the flow of entering the museum. And I think that was a part of it. There's an element of institutional critique, I think, in some of her ideas. There's one more thought.
Well, and that
Yeah.
part of that placement, as I recall, Lauren, part of why the placement, I mean, we had institutional reasons that we didn't want the work to be there, having to do with safety and insurance and these different things, but also that was at a time when she was still in Los Angeles, and she was going to actually, quote unquote, make the work, right? But then once she left the city and that didn't become possible, we were looking at a different kind of work, really. Yeah.
Can I ask, to that point, when was the decision oh, sorry, Lauren. When was the decision then made to kind of not make a work out of it? I mean, very much she could have given instructions and kind of said something, but was it made early on, kind of in kind of pandemic installation, that the work would just not exist and it would only be the pieces?
Well, before answering that question of yours, Nick, with Connie, just two more little points about the earlier question about the site. I do want to say that no matter what site she gets or is allocated, Sarah was very involved in the experience that you would have of it. So for example, the gallery, the lobby that she's in, the gallery lobby, sorry, lobby gallery, the doors are locked and nobody can go in. And that's a gesture towards where she is that she made very strong. Or the way in which the works are in a grid at the Huntington and at the Hammer is a response to the kind of space that, you know, she was allocated. So I think there's an intervention into the allocated space that in a way co-ops that allocated space. That's all I'm saying. And then I think, Connie, you answered the question earlier about kind of when it became a potential for a work instead of a work, which is that when COVID kind of interfered with her ability to make the work, since the performance of the body and stacking and staging the sculptures was interfered with by COVID. Yeah.
I have a question from, there's a question from Jay Tolentino. First, quick comment. Is it compelling that she borrows, in quotes, what she finds as her work, monumentalizing via platform, then returns the objects? And the question is, can you ask on my behalf, does she think of her work as intact if and when it is photographed and documented like how we are seeing it? Or where do you think? Yes, I guess that would be the first question, is the work intact when it is photographed and documented, or is it upon seeing it?
I mean, those are all exactly the questions the work raises, I think. I mean, I would say that what we're looking at actually is not the work. I think this is what she would say, is that what the work is at this moment is what I read to you, is that text. So actually what the work is the kind of potential for an artwork to become. And I think there still is the hope that once the show opens and she comes to Los Angeles, it could be that it even becomes something happens. I don't know. And that's also, I mean, there's so many historical precedents for that. It's really, you know, this idea that the work could change over time. So, but right now it exists in a state of kind of potential. And so what you saw, what was photographed is not the work. What was photographed is somehow a document, I would say, of something that's in between. Which I think is perfect. I mean, it's exactly where she is most comfortable with the work in a way. I think this question that's in Jay's question here in the chat, this notion of borrowing, I think is quite interesting, borrowing and returning. And again, I think it's a way of it's almost as though she sort of honors the materials more than she honors what they become or what they could potentially become. Like the materials have a life before us and they're going to have a life after the Hammer Museum that somehow supersedes whatever it is that they might become at the Hammer Museum. So that almost becomes a further kind of, you know, double negative, if you will, or a further kind of way of devaluing the status as sculpture, if it ever becomes such, if that's clear. But the borrowing is quite a nice part of the work, I think.
I think we have time for one more question, one last question. We have a question from Nancy Berman. How was it decided that her work at the Huntington would be outside? Was that an offer to her out of her desire? Thanks
for the question, Nancy. As Lauren says, it was actually the site that she preferred. But it does raise interest, or just reminds me to tell you that there are, of course, interesting institutional questions always with this work. Like that lobby gallery at the Hammer, unbeknownst to probably most of you, has a lot of restrictions in it because it isn't climatized, you know, it has issues with light. It's actually very restrictive what can be shown there. And the other thing I would say is when you bring trash in off the street, the museum, any museum, needs to impose all kinds of restrictions on that, because you can't bring bugs in, you can't bring in mold, you can't, you know, you have to put fire retardant. So you do all of these things to it that in a way kind of kill the material's ability to actually just be a found object in a funny way. So so I'm guessing that part of her decision at the Huntington was about being outside was maybe to have a different kind of context in which to work. So you have the in-gallery, the institutional, very restrictive kind of situation on one hand, and then the outside, which appears to be more open-ended, although I think, you know, has also its other restrictions. Yeah, Lauren.
Lauren, you're muted.
I just wanted to say that she did pick that site amongst options outside, but originally, Connie, if I remember correctly, she would have been open to being inside, but it wasn't possible.
Okay.
She would have been open to that originally, but the Huntington had all of the issues that you just brought up, which was, it was very hard to put that kind of work with all of its unpredictabilities into either a series of galleries that are close to a permanent collection, or into a gallery that's close to a storage and to all kinds of other tools of installations. I just wanted to clarify because I didn't want to mislead you guys with that.
Well, thank you all for your great questions. I think you find the work as thought-provoking as I do. So thanks for your attention, and I look forward to being able to welcome you all to see it. We all want you to come see it, so hopefully soon. Great.